It's predicted to be worse than Hurricane Katrina, worse than the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Scientists and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, are warning of a pending doom for the Pacific Northwest. An earthquake along a little-known fault line that would kill thousands and affect millions. The Cascadia subduction zone stretches about 700 miles from Cape Mendocino, California, to Vancouver, Canada. Big cities expected to be affected include Seattle and Portland. Some scientists believe the earthquake, when it goes off, will reach between 8.7 and 9.2 on the Richter scale and cause a tsunami. So will this new revelation become a reality? Is it only a matter of time?
The federal government estimates 13,000 Americans will die in a major earthquake and tsunami in the Pacific Northwest. It's not a question of whether, but when. This earthquake is coming, and it's overdue. Consider that the magnitude 9.0 earthquake in Japan just a few years ago, remember that, killed more than 15,000 people in the north of Japan and injured thousands of others. Seismologists say that the quake that will strike on our Pacific Northwest coastline should be even stronger, at up to a 9.2. They call such a quake a margin rupture quake, and it's every bit as bad as it sounds. Here's the reason for it. Our entire continent sits on the North American tectonic shelf, right? Plate, I should say. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, from the top of Washington State all the way down to northern California. This is it. And another plate called the Juan de Fuca is trying to slide up under North America, but it's stuck. We have an illustration over here in the big wall. Let me show you what this is. This is our continent here. This is the Cascada Mountains. This is the Cascadia, what do they call it? The Cascadia what? Bridge. The Cascadia Bridge. I was actually asking him, but thank you. The North American plate here and the Juan de Fuca plate here. This one's sliding up under, and eventually this is going to go down, send a huge wall of water up. That wall will go all the way over to Japan, and the other will come onto our shore within 15 minutes. And when it slips, it will unleash not only a colossal earthquake, but also that tsunami, 700 miles long, and in some places up to a 100-foot high wall of water and whatever it's pushing, like houses and dump trucks and schools. Thousands and thousands will not escape. The New Yorker quotes a FEMA official who says, and I quote, "Our operating assumption is that everything west of Interstate 5 will be toast." Everything west of Interstate 5 is gone. That's Seattle, Tacoma, Portland and Olympia, Salem and Eugene, wiped out. Altogether about 7 million people. That's not including tourists. So think of summertime. The New Yorker reports that FEMA calculations indicate the disaster will damage or destroy about 1 million buildings, including 3,000 schools and 1/3 of all fire stations. And perhaps the worst part of all of this, these sorts of earthquakes happen at regular intervals in exactly this part of the world, have forever. On average, according to seismologists, about every 240 years. So when was the last one of these massive 9.2 or so earthquakes? Well, the last one was more than 300 years ago, the year 1700. It struck in the Pacific Northwest and sent a 600-foot wave of water all the way to Japan. So right now, on average, the Pacific Northwest is decades overdue for the really, really big one. Michio Kaku is a physicist and professor at City College of New York. This article is stunning. Is it overstated in any way?
No, the Cascadia Fault is an earthquake waiting to happen. We know it's going to happen with an energy 30 times the maximum energy of the San Andreas Fault. So Hollywood has us brainwashed into thinking the big one is going to be in California. No, the Cascadia Fault would pack energy 30 times the energy that the San Andreas Fault can muster.
The article speaks of a liquefaction of the earth, that part of the earth will turn to liquid.
That's right. We're talking about major energy surges inside the ground that'll cause it to liquefy. We've seen that in Japan. We saw that at Fukushima, and it's almost like quicksand. One day you're walking on solid ground, the next you're falling right into a quicksand.
This earthquake would last 4 minutes or more, the rattling and the shaking, and then within 15 minutes they estimate this wall of water. In the entire inundation zone, you could have water up to 100 feet high.
That's right, and in the inundation zone, we have 70,000 people that have almost no clue as to what could happen. You know, in Japan, you have to live with earthquakes every day. Children go through tests and drills. People are conscious of this. But in the Pacific Northwest, it barely rates on the radar screen.
There's something that happens before the shaking that we can sense, that sensors can pick up. That's an early warning system that they have all over Japan, especially in the north and in the Tokyo area. They've been trying to get it pushed through, look for money for it in the Seattle-Tacoma area, nothing.
That's right. Before the earthquake actually hits, there's a compression wave that is detected by animals, for example. Animals start to act very strange, and we've seen that happen before earthquakes. And then a minute, 2 minutes later, boom, you head for the hills because there's nothing left to do except to go to high ground.
You mentioned what this sort of event has caused in history.
That's right. In the year 1700, there was a massive earthquake and tsunami which surged over Japan. And then running the videotape backwards, you can actually see that in 1700 it originated with a Cascadia fault. And then we physicists can calculate the energy, the magnitude, the dynamics once we got these two events linked together. And that was only done in the last decade or so.
And you mentioned Mount Everest.
That's right. Mount Everest is also created by the collision of two faults, just like what we have here. The one fault going under, the other fault going over, and that created the Himalayan mountains. That created Mount Everest. That's the power packed by the subduction zone earthquake.
Okay. Averages of when things are going to happen are really not very reliable. I think they use by example, the difference between 4 and 6 is 2. I forget exactly how they did it. We can't be sure exactly when this is going to happen, but we're positive it's going to happen. If you lived in the Pacific Northwest, you had little kids, would you live there?
I'd think twice. I would have to drill them just like what they do in Japan, be part of their life in terms of having an emergency kit, where to go in case of an emergency, what to do, what frequencies to go to, and so on and so forth. And by the way, we know that this is going to happen because by simply drilling into the seafloor, we can see evidence of ancient tsunamis going back 10,000 years. And we've known that
how many over that period?
41, which means that the time between the cycles is about 240 years.
Wow.
And it's been 315 years since the last big one.
From the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, welcome to a presentation on Great Cascadia earthquakes. If you're not familiar with the fact that we have the potential for an earthquake larger than California will ever experience, an earthquake that really defies description, then you're going to be pretty surprised today. And you're probably going to end up feeling a little bit like this guy. But bear with me, because this is important information. You know, we live in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. We're blessed that way. But it's also an incredibly dynamic landscape. And the same geologic forces that have created this beautiful landscape also give us some pretty serious natural hazards. Our coastline, where the largest ocean in the world meets the North American continent. It's a beautiful place, but it's not without its own hazards, as anybody who lives at the coast will know. We forget sometimes that we live within an active volcanic mountain range. In fact, over the last 4,000 years, there have been 57 major eruptions in the Cascades. There's certainly a possibility that we will see an eruption from one of these great Cascade volcanoes at some point, maybe in our lifetimes. In fact, just 30 years ago or so, the eruption of Mount St. Helens woke the whole Pacific Northwest up to the potential of these great eruptions. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was also one of the first indications that geologic forces that have created our beautiful dynamic landscape also had the potential to create massive earthquakes. Other geologic discoveries soon followed, including the discovery of the Ghost Forest on the Copalis River near Willapa Bay. An ancient western red cedar forest discovered in the mid-1980s that had died suddenly. Scientists like Dr. Brian Atwater realized that probably the death of this great ghost forest was the result of a great earthquake at some point in our past, and in fact tree ring samples indicated that it must have happened sometime around 1699 to 1700. He and other researchers also began looking in tidal marshes up and down the Pacific Northwest coast, and what they found was a thin layer of tsunami sand, sandwiched in between topsoils, which indicated that massive earthquakes that generated tsunamis had happened in the past. In fact, as geologists dug down into the tidal marshes, they found tsunami sands in a layer cake over and over and over, which indicated that these great earthquakes had happened many, many times in the last few thousand years, with the last one dating to January 26, 1700. The earthquakes are caused by two tectonic plates pushing against each other. Here's a satellite image of the Northwest. There we are in Oregon, and here is the Juan de Fuca plate, a tiny remnant of a very ancient tectonic plate, an oceanic plate that pushes against North America as North America moves west at about an inch a year. You know, we just don't get a lot of earthquakes in Oregon. We live in a quiet zone. The largest earthquakes we've ever had in recorded history are the two Klamath Falls earthquakes in 1993, both magnitude 6s that occurred just a couple of hours apart, and the Scotts Mills earthquake that also happened in 1993, a magnitude 5.6. That earthquake caused about $30 million worth of damage in the Portland metro area, which indicates we're really not ready for any type of earthquake. So where these two tectonic plates meet and are pushing against each other, that creates a 600-mile long earthquake fault called the Cascadia subduction zone. The Juan de Fuca plate is actually diving under North America in a process called subduction. There are subduction zones all over the world, especially along the Pacific Rim, the Ring of Fire. Here's where it gets kind of hard to believe. We know that in the last 10,000 years, there have been 20 magnitude 9 plus earthquakes along this 600-mile long earthquake fault that sits about 75 miles off our coast. We also know now from recent geologic evidence that there have been another 20 earthquakes along the southern portion of the 600-mile long earthquake fault over the last 10,000 years. So the bottom 300 miles of the earthquake fault from Northern California to about offshore Florence or Newport have ruptured 20 times over the last 10,000 years. That means that over the last 10,000 years there have been 40 great subduction zone earthquakes, magnitude 8 or greater. If you average that out, that's about once every 250 years. The last of these great earthquakes was 310 years ago. Here's another way to look at it. I made up this really nifty little chart that looks at 10,000 years of human history. It starts at 8,000 BC. The large red lines are magnitude 9 plus earthquakes. The smaller red lines are magnitude 8 to 9 earthquakes. As we march through time, you can see that these earthquakes, magnitude 8 to 9 plus earthquakes, happen on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes there's small clusters, sometimes there's a few hundred years apart. The last 1,000 years we've had 4 magnitude 8.5 to 9 plus earthquakes along the Cascadia subduction zone, about 75 miles off the coast. We know in looking at these 40 events over the last 10,000 years that 75% of these earthquakes have occurred less than 310 years apart. This certainly suggests that we're within the window to get one of these great Cascadia earthquakes at any time. What do we know about Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes? They're big. They can generate up to magnitude 9 plus earthquakes. We also know these earthquakes can last a long time, but it's a different type of shaking than we're used to thinking about or seeing in the news. You're talking about long period earthquake waves, long rolling earthquake waves. Wood frame homes do very well in these types of earthquakes. Steel reinforced buildings do just fine in these types of earthquakes. Infrastructure, not so good. That's what suffers in these big earthquakes. The good thing is you can prepare for one of these types of earthquakes. The bad news is it's the infrastructure that suffers, the infrastructure that we rely on in our daily lives. Roads, bridges, power, water, sewer, natural gas, communications. These are the things that take a big hit in these types of big earthquakes. We know that this earthquake, when it happens, will directly affect 13 million plus people. That's everybody from Northern California up through southern British Columbia. Everybody west of the Cascades they're going to get the hell shaken out of them. Once again, very, very survivable earthquakes if you're prepared. But remember, if there are 13 million people affected by this earthquake, it may take a while for help to arrive. That's why it's so important to be prepared. Once again, these are very survivable earthquakes. But unless you're prepared, you end up becoming a victim. These earthquakes also generate tsunamis. So 15 minutes on the south coast and 30 minutes on the north coast after the earthquake is over, a 30 to 50 foot wall of water will slam into coastal communities. If you live at the coast, if you visit the coast, it's imperative that you have a plan, know your evacuation routes, know how to get to high ground. We know that there's going to be a lot of damage to infrastructure. In 2009, ODOT did a study that looked at bridges that would be damaged in a magnitude 9 earthquake. Especially the big bridges along Highway 101 are going to be damaged or destroyed. Highway 101 will cease to exist as a transportation corridor. I-5 will suffer damage to the point where I-5 will cease to exist as a transportation corridor. When I say help is not going to arrive quickly, I mean it's going to be tough for first responders to get over the mountains, to move on Highway 101, and until I-5 is reopened, there's no help coming. You're literally on your own. There have been some really big earthquakes since 1960. These are all subduction zone earthquakes that have happened around the world. The 1964 Alaskan earthquake was the second largest earthquake in recorded history. The 1960 Chilean earthquake, magnitude 9.5, was the largest earthquake in recorded history, larger than all the earthquakes in the 20th century combined. The Chilean earthquake in 2010, last year, a magnitude 8.8 earthquake, is very typical of the type of damage that we expect to see in a subduction zone earthquake here in the Pacific Northwest. This earthquake struck at about 3 o'clock in the morning. It lasted for a minute and a half, and while there were 15 million people affected by the earthquake, I mean they felt the earthquake and they suffered damage in one way or another, there were only 521 fatalities. 400 of those fatalities were directly related to the earthquake itself. Only 121 fatalities from the tsunami. This is a well-prepared country for earthquakes. They've had some of the largest earthquakes in the world in the last 50 years, and they've been working very hard to get prepared for the next one. As it is, they lost power in many parts of the country for a week, some parts of the country for as much as 2 weeks. There were no communications for at least 2 weeks in many parts of the country. Infrastructure took a great deal of damage in this earthquake. Roads and bridges were primarily the biggest hit in the damage in the area, especially at the coast. And that's something that we can expect to see here in the Pacific Northwest. Chile has been working very hard to prepare their roads and bridges for great earthquakes, and even then they suffered a great deal of damage in this 90-second earthquake. We haven't done as much in the Pacific Northwest, so we can expect to see much more damage to roads and bridges in the earthquake when it happens to us. We also saw some damage to tall buildings, but very few buildings actually fell over. Brick and mortar buildings take the most damage in earthquakes like this, these long period earthquake waves. And that's typical of what we'll see here in the Pacific Northwest. But for the most part, steel reinforced buildings, concrete reinforced buildings, homes, wood frame buildings do very well in these types of earthquakes. This is Santiago International Airport, which is a telling reminder of what we can expect to see happen at PDX and the other airports in our region. This airport was closed for a week, not necessarily because of damage to the runway or the control tower, but to damage inside the terminal itself, non-structural damage. That's where most of the accidents happen, most of the injuries happen in big earthquakes, is from non-structural damage, things falling on you inside buildings. Half of the hospitals in Chile suffered some sort of damage or another, which meant they lost about half of their hospital beds. And I think this is going to be typical of what we see in the Pacific Northwest. There will be reduced capacity in all of our hospitals. This is a grocery store in Santiago, and this is once again typical of the things that happen, especially in big cities, before the local authorities can come and literally commandeer grocery stores and pharmacies. So putting an emergency plan in place, putting an emergency kit together with extra food, water, and medication becomes really, really important, because we don't expect to see any help arriving for possibly a week, maybe longer in some parts of the state. First responders who went through the earthquake, just like everybody else in Chile, weren't able to respond because their vehicles either suffered damage, they were at home and they had to take care of their families. So thinking that you're going to be rescued or helped by first responders, fire, police, emergency personnel, Red Cross, that's not going to happen. The tsunami that hit the coast was incredibly destructive. Water up to 30 feet high roared into many communities and stayed in many communities, coming in and out for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, the water picked up boats, shipping containers, cars, and used them as battering rams inside coastal communities. And there was a great deal of destruction. But once again, only 121 fatalities from the tsunami itself. This country has been through earthquakes and tsunamis in the past. They know what to do. They have good emergency plans in place. Families share the information, and even though this earthquake struck at 3 o'clock in the morning, people knew at the coast when they felt the ground shake to head to high ground. Chileans know that earthquakes in and of themselves are not disasters or catastrophes. They're really just hazards, much like other natural hazards, windstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes. Hazards become disasters because of the actions we take, where we choose to live, where we choose to work, and how we prepare for one of these next great disasters.